has Omicron peaked yet in Oregon? Well, brace yourself, because according to our poop, no. But health experts think infections will peak in the next week as the variant runs out of people to infect. In the meantime, you, the viewers, had a lot to say about Oregon's not actually permanent mask rule. A lot of you wanted metrics for when OHA would rescind that rule. Cut to today's press conference.
We have some general considerations written into the rule for what will be considered for rescission of the rule. Hospitalizations and hospital capacity will be key amongst those.
And remember that OSU study about how hemp might prevent COVID? Well, now researchers have tried it out on actual patients taking CBD. And sorry to be a buzzkill, but smoking pot still won't work. Here's the story.
I heard our editors say they had options for today's open. I didn't know that one of the options included a full boxer's arm, like popping out of a pot leaf. That was fantastic. Happy Friday, everybody. I'm Maggie Vespa. Welcome to The Story, the show where we want to hear from you. Contact info is at the bottom of our screen, so you can email thestory@kgw.com. You can use that hashtag, TheStoryKGW. Your questions and your comments seriously drive our coverage. So that in mind, let's get started. Start with the big story, which you guessed it, is about COVID. Oregon actually hit another record high number of new cases today, with the state reporting almost 11,000. So the question now is, when will the Omicron variant peak and when will cases start going back down? Health officials think it'll happen pretty soon. Here's Pat Doris.
Over the last several weeks, people around the Northwest have heard the repeated warnings about Omicron and its swift spread. Turns out many of us are changing our behavior because of it, getting boosters, wearing masks, keeping our distance, avoiding crowded indoor spaces. And it's making a difference, says Peter Graven, who creates the pandemic forecast for Oregon. He now predicts the height of hospitalizations will be around 1,500 people, still way above the last high with Delta, but lower than feared. He also expects the most people to be hospitalized around February 1st, 5 days later than he earlier expected.
So this is mostly good news, and it reflects the fact that actually, as fast as it's growing here, it actually was expected to grow even faster. And so the slower growth is actually due to what I believe I'm seeing as behavior change by many Oregonians.
That's not to say the danger has passed. In Lincoln County on Oregon's coast, the cases are piling up fast. Since January 1st, 1,212 new cases. That's a ton for the rural county. The cases this month make up 23% of all the cases in Lincoln County since the start of the pandemic. Susan Traxel is the spokesperson for public health in Lincoln County and crunched the numbers.
Well, I like math, so I was doing the math to see how severe this was, and I was surprised. I was really shocked to see that it was 1 in 4 in the last 3 weeks.
She said there were 169 new cases for Lincoln County yesterday. The numbers are overwhelming public health, who struggle to notify people about their positive tests.
Sometimes we get those test results before the patient does, and we really want to let them know as soon as possible. But if we can't get to them, it may be 3, 4, 5 days before they even know that their test came back positive. And that's a worry for us.
Overall, Lincoln County has a relatively high vaccination rate, with 79% of those 18 and older fully vaccinated. But she said many are not boosted and should be. Oregon's state epidemiologist, Dr. Dean Seidlinger, told reporters today Omicron is still a big problem statewide.
The Omicron variant continues to cut a destructive swath through Oregon, fueling steadily rising hospitalizations, record-shattering daily cases, and a staggering test positivity rate.
But he also acknowledged the good news, the daily changes that many people are making to slow the spread of the virus.
I want to thank the vast majority of Oregonians who continue to take these steps to protect themselves, their loved ones, and our communities. Your actions have helped keep the death rate from COVID amongst the lowest when we compare ourselves to other states.
Pat Doris, KGW News.
All right, well, speaking of COVID forecasts, here's a story from Portland Monthly that we think is worth your time. The headline, wow, Omicron hasn't peaked in Oregon yet, at least not according to our poop. Hope you're having a nice dinner. That's right. Wastewater is actually a great yet gross yet great way to track COVID. In other parts of the country, actually, like Boston and the Bay Area, wastewater is showing a decline in the virus. But the latest data for Oregon doesn't show that same decline yet. Here's a graph plotting wastewater samples in the Portland area over the past month. You can see the viral concentration started rising in mid-December, which is when Omicron started rising as well. And over the past few weeks, it's been consistently high and it's holding steady. It is worth noting these samples are delayed by a week or so because it takes that long to collect and test them, but it still tracks with what health officials are saying, which is that Oregon has not reached its Omicron peak yet. All right, time now for your questions about that permanent mask mandate that OHA says will actually be temporary. Okay, so last night we played sound from a public hearing. People blasted the agency for even considering a permanent rule mandating masks indoors. And they said they do not care if the state says it plans to rescind the rule when cases drop.
I no longer have any faith in OHA and the mask mandate today. And before you tell me that a permanent mandate can be canceled at any time, I don't care.
Like we said, they don't care. The OHA says the temporary rule they have in place right now ends after 180 days. That's February 8th. It's a Tuesday. They also say state law prohibits them from implementing another temporary rule for the same purpose. They can't do that in any situation, including this one. They have to either drop the mandate or make it permanent. So hearing that, Joe wrote, it would be irresponsible for OHA to let the temporary rule on masks lapse after the 180-day period during the Omicron surge. Their only choice is to adopt the mask rule as a permanent rule, which then allows them to repeal it when it is safe for the public to do so. And then he added, yes, the terminologies are awkward. Sarah was more blunt. She wrote, many Oregonians I know are in favor of the permanent mask mandate because we know it's temporary. We're not stupid. Like we said, blunt. Then there were those of you who had some follow-up questions about this. Todd wrote, they need to, at a minimum, give some kind of a metric when the mandate would be rescinded, especially if they're going to call it permanent. There needs to be a safety measure or law when it would be rescinded. It's almost like putting someone in jail without a sentence or a time frame. Well, Todd, fantastic timing. You are not the only one who had that question. In fact, here's a clip from that press conference with OHA today.
As for benchmarks, I think, we have some general considerations written into the rule for what will be considered for rescission of the rule. As I stated, focusing on hospitalizations and hospital capacity will be key amongst those. Those can impact the ability of our healthcare partners to deliver care to all Oregonians, regardless of whether they have COVID-19 or other things. Picking a specific number is difficult as we are currently still on the rise of this current peak.
So the translation there, the permanent but temporary mask mandate rule will take COVID stats into account when OHA is making the decision to rescind that rule. But right now they're not nailing down, or at least not releasing, any specific numbers that they'll use to make that call. So then Scott had a question. He wrote, they are telling us that the mask mandate can only last 180 days and cannot be issued again without making it permanent. It seems like we've been wearing masks for 2 years. Was there any kind of mandate prior to the current one? Scott, awesome point. And the answer is yes, there was. It came courtesy of Governor Brown's executive order, which made masks mandatory from the start of the pandemic until June 30th, 2021, when she celebrated Oregon's grand reopening. Providence Park, remember that? Well, a few months after that, Delta hit. And then cases surged again, and the Oregon Health Authority basically took the reins on this, implementing the current mask rule. Now, in light of this debate, though, we asked the governor, why not take the reins back? Why not implement another executive order with an expiration date and then kind of bypass this OHA permanent mess? And her office wrote back basically saying they tried to avoid executive orders as much as possible because basically they're not exactly that popular. And they wrote, when the governor lifted most executive orders in June 2021, although we knew the pandemic was not over, we began the transition from managing the pandemic under emergency powers to managing the pandemic under ordinary government processes like agency rulemaking to address COVID-19, as we would with any other established public health challenge. They add those processes incorporate public input, which executive orders do not. I think that's really important. So then another viewer, Bronwyn, asked, instead of creating a new law for mandatory masks, why not change the old law by eliminating the 180-day rule? We're going to end with that question. I think that's a great one. Bronwyn, good idea. The next legislative session starts February 1st, so lawmakers would have a week to make it happen before that February 8th deadline. Now, those sessions do tend to be jam-packed with bills and issues, I'm sure you know, and political divides have been strikingly wide in Salem in recent years. So we're not going to say it's not looking good. We'll just at this point say we'll definitely keep you posted on any updates. Okay, let's pivot now to some COVID news that's a little more positive. And yes, we actually do have some. Once again, it involves marijuana, okay, which means it is time for another edition of Vice News. So snazzy, love it. This Vice News story actually comes from Vice News itself. Fantastic. A new study suggests that CBD prevents COVID infection, and they tested it out on actual patients. A team from the University of Chicago and the University of Louisville studied 1,200 people who were prescribed oral CBD to treat seizure-related conditions. About 6% of those patients tested positive during the study, compared to about 9% of people who were not taking CBD. The researchers also confirmed those results in a lab using human lung cells. Now, if this study sounds familiar, it's probably because you remember our story from last week on Oregon State University's hemp study. Scientists there found that a pair of cannabinoid acids, which are found in hemp, can block COVID from infecting human cells. Unlike the CBD study, this one was done only in a lab, not with actual patients. But the lead researcher told us that is the next step. And by the way, we do want to reiterate, he also told us this.
People who are home, sitting at home, and they're wondering, does consuming cannabis in very common forms, including smoking it, give me these benefits? What's the answer?
Well, definitely the benefit for preventing viral infection of cells must come from cannabinoid acids, which are heat sensitive and must not be smoked.
Professor, before I ask you a follow-up question, you know that you just bummed out a lot of stoners, right?
Well, that's not my job.
He was so kind in that moment. We really appreciate it. By the way, again, sorry for the buzzkill stoners. We hate to do it. We just had to reiterate that. Okay, here's some more good COVID news. It's a nice change of pace on a Friday. At least this is good if you live in Washington. The state just launched its website where you can order free at-home test kits. And yes, it's got a catchy little name. It's Say Yes COVID Test. Okay. We have a link to it up at kgw.com right now. Now, this is separate, we should note, from the federal government's new program that lets you order 4 free tests to be shipped to your home. If you live in Washington, you can now order up to 5 extra tests from the state. You're just flush with tests at this point. Once you place an order, it'll take a week or 2 for those tests to arrive. And yes, they will only ship to Washington addresses. So Oregonians, we're so sorry. You're still out of luck. Now, we asked the Oregon Health Authority if they are planning to set up a free test portal like this one, and their response was, not at this time. Got it? They previously said they do not have the capacity to individually send out tests, but they are distributing millions of free tests to local health centers, to schools, shelters, and community organizations this month. Okay, still ahead on the story. Remember the sexual abuse case against Portland real estate developer Terry Bean? Well, prosecutors just dropped all of the charges against him. And plus, it's the end of an era in Salem. All party leadership is turning over this year, along with the governor's office. We'll talk more about those changes when the story continues. Welcome back. Keep sending in your questions and comments to the story at kgw.com. They say the wheels of justice grind slow, and there may be no better example of that than the long-running criminal case against Portland real estate developer and political donor Terry Bean. The state actually quietly dropped sex abuse charges last week in a case that dates back almost a decade. Here's Kyle Aboshi.
In a case with more twists and turns than a Netflix drama series, the long-running prosecution of Terry Bean is over. Last week, state prosecutors quietly dropped sex abuse charges against the Portland real estate investor, civil rights activist, and big-time Democratic political fundraiser. In a statement his lawyer wrote, Terry Bean has continually maintained his innocence and is pleased the state has dismissed all criminal charges. The case goes back almost a decade and involves allegations of embezzlement, lies, and misdeeds. 2 lawyers associated with the case are under investigation by the state bar. A police detective was accused of misconduct, and there were claims that Bean tried to pay off his victim. It all started in 2013. Prosecutors said Bean and his then boyfriend, Kyle Lawson, sexually abused a 15-year-old boy in Eugene. Lawson was convicted of that crime in 2019 and sentenced to 2 years in prison. But for a variety of reasons, Bean's trial was pushed back. Then in late December, prosecutors said the alleged victim decided he didn't want to take the witness stand, writing, "The alleged victim in this matter communicated to me unequivocally that he is relocated out of state and he no longer wishes to participate in this pending prosecution." We don't know if Bean or his lawyer made any payment leading to the dismissal of charges. Nobody would say. Bean is still facing 2 civil lawsuits in federal court, including one filed by that same alleged victim who's now refusing to testify. Kyle Aboshi, KGW News.
Let's pivot now to politics and some big changes happening in Salem. In fact, the people in charge of both parties in the legislature have either recently stepped down or are planning to, and new leaders are taking over. Today, in fact, is House Speaker Tina Kotek's last day in office. She's resigning as she focuses on her campaign for governor. The Democrats are nominating Representative Dan Rayfield to take over in her place. At the same time, Representative Barbara Smith Warner is stepping down as House Majority Leader, but she is staying on as a state rep. Senate President Peter Courtney also announcing he is retiring. On the Republican side, Representative Christine Drazen recently stepped down as House Minority Leader to focus on her campaign for governor. Unlike Kotek, she is remaining in office for now. And Senator Fred Girod also stepping down as Senate Minority Leader, telling us last year that he likely will not run again. On top of all of that, it is Kate Brown's last year as governor because she has a term limit. She's up against that limit now. So our own Laurel Porter talked to political analyst Len Bergstein about these leadership changes this week on Straight Talk.
This is a bit of an end of an era, isn't it?
It really is. We've seen eras pass in the past. The Kits and Katz era with John Kitzhaber and Vera Katz, and it always is a time to pause and see, gee, what kind of phase Oregon's going through. But there's a lot of leadership there. The Senate will, Democrats have got a good slate of people to take over for Peter. Now, Peter is a real institutionalist, so people will recognize his loss, I think, in terms of his love of the process. And also, I think what we'll see is a slight move to the center by the Democrats in the Senate and a slight move to the center by Democrats in the House. So there'll be some of that. The Republicans have a leader. They've swapped out Christine Drazen, who's running for governor, for Vicky Iverson Breeze, who acknowledges that she really takes issue with the last election. She denies the last election. And so the Republicans may move a little bit to the right in the Oregon State Legislature, and it'll set up the potential for some conflict.
You can watch the full interview tonight on Straight Talk at 7 p.m. Laurel is also talking to Republican Representative Ron Noble, who is running for Congress, about new police reform laws he helped pass. This week marks 233 years since the last big one hit, and Washington just released some new maps showing what could happen when the next big one hits. Their message? It's not so much the height of the tsunami, but the speed that we should worry about. When the story continues. Welcome back. So earlier this week, we talked about the small tsunami that hit the West Coast after the massive volcano eruption in Tonga. And then we got this email from Veronica, who wrote, if you go down to Lincoln City in the Taft district, right by the bridge, there is a giant sign that talks about a tsunami that hit a long time ago and wiped out an entire Native American village. It hit January 26th, 1700 at night around 9 p.m. Veronica, thank you so much. She's absolutely right. 322 years ago this month was when the last big one hit the Pacific Northwest and generated a big tsunami. And by big, we don't just mean how high the waves are, but also how fast they move. And in fact, Washington just released some new maps that show the danger of fast-moving tsunami waves on the coast. Here's Glenn Farley from our sister station in Seattle.
Washington's coastline is both beautiful and complex. It's this complexity of islands and inlets that makes predicting how a tsunami will play out that's led to new mapping.
So how fast will the waves travel?
Of not only how deep tsunami waves will be, but how fast that water will move.
Understanding the currents and where they're the fastest is incredibly important. This darkest purple color here is about 18, 19 knots, 21 knots here. For reference, a strong tide or an average strong current is on the order of 1 to 3 knots. Right. So these are incredibly fast moving waves.
It's this kind of devastation we saw in Japan almost 11 years ago that's expected to be very similar to what we'll see from a massive magnitude 9 quake off our own coast from a giant fault known as the Cascadia subduction zone. But there's also the threat from long-distance tsunamis. One came last weekend after that incredible volcanic explosion in Tonga. We did see tsunamis here on the West Coast. In Washington, that resulted in a tsunami wave of more than a foot in La Push, Nia Bay and Port Angeles at nearly a foot, but in California, it ranged up to 4.3 feet in Port San Luis.
This could have been worse, especially because it was such a unique event. We have never had a volcanic eruption produce a tsunami that traveled all the way across the Pacific since we've had warning systems.
But even those waves aren't just the normal waves we're used to, says state seismologist and tsunami researcher Harold Tobin.
People hear about a 1 to 3 foot wave, they think big deal. I go down to the beach, I see waves that big all the time. It's not the same thing. The tsunami is a rush of water, like a tidal bore or like the tide coming in as a wall. And if it's there and it's coming up, it's moving much faster than you can outrun it.
Glenn Farley, King 5 News.
All right, ominous warning to keep in mind. Keep sending in your questions and comments to the story at kgw.com. We're going to finish the show on a Friday, coming up next. This week's Hey Help cause is Brown Hope. They help Black, Brown, and Indigenous Portlanders through what they call a healing justice framework. And that work comes in many forms, like direct cash assistance to help them meet financial basic needs, and also creating community spaces for neighbors to support each other. Here is Chief Healing Officer Cameron Witten.
At Brown Hope, we heal with hope. We believe that healing is the pathway to justice, and that a just and healed world is only possible through working together, through nurturing our spirits and taking bold, sustained action. And so that's what we do with our mission, our vision, our 12 principles, and our programs. We commit every day to our dream of racial justice and healing.
If you would like to donate, hold up your phone's camera to that QR code on your screen. You can also go to kgw.com/heyhelp. And while you're holding your phone, follow us on Twitter at @TheStoryKGW, or you can email the story at kgw.com. That does it for The Story on this Friday. The news at 6:30 with Laurel Porter starts now.
This is KGW News at
Welcome to KGW News at 6:30. We begin here with Metro and State of the Region address today. It largely focused on homelessness, affordable